Under the blazing African sun, thousands of British soldiers lay dead in the dust, their red uniforms faded, their empire's pride buried beside them. What was meant to be a quick victory had turned into a nightmare of ambushes, starvation, and humiliation. Entire battalions vanished into the veld, swallowed by farmers who fought like ghosts. Reports back to London spoke of disaster, of generals defeated by men with no formal army, no medals, no mercy. This wasn't a rebellion. It was an empire's reckoning. The Second Boer War, the conflict Britain tried to erase from its own history, wasn't just a fight for land. It was the moment the greatest power on earth was brought to its knees by the people it called inferior. A war that shattered illusions, redrew Africa's fate, and exposed the lies behind empire. When we talk about the British Empire, we often imagine red-coated soldiers, vast colonies, and a power that ruled the world. But behind that glory lies one of the darkest, most brutal wars the empire ever fought. A war it tried to forget. The Second Boer War wasn't just a battle for land. It was a war that exposed the cruelty of imperial ambition, the suffering of civilians, and the beginning of the end for Britain's global dominance. What makes it even more shocking, it was also the birthplace of something the world had never seen before: concentration camps. At the turn of the 20th century, South Africa became the epicenter of greed and control. Beneath its soil lay gold, vast amounts of it, and gold meant power. The British Empire wanted it. The Boer settlers, descendants of Dutch farmers, refused to give it up. What began as a political dispute soon turned into one of the most devastating colonial wars in modern history. The Boers fought fiercely, using guerrilla tactics, ambushes, and hit-and-run attacks. The British, frustrated and humiliated by early defeats, retaliated with a new level of cruelty. They burned farms, destroyed livestock, and rounded up women and children into barbed wire camps. But here's what history books rarely show: over 26,000 women and children, most of them civilians, died in those camps, not from bullets, but from starvation, disease, and neglect. Some were so malnourished that their bones pressed through their skin. The photographs of their frail bodies, once hidden, later horrified the world. For the first time, the British public began questioning their own empire. How could a nation that prided itself on civilization and justice commit such acts? And yet, those responsible justified it as necessary for victory. The Second Boer War wasn't just a South African tragedy. It was a warning to the world. It exposed how far empires would go to protect their wealth and pride, even at the cost of innocent lives. This war changed everything: the way nations fought, the way propaganda shaped truth, and the way ordinary people suffered under imperial power. It's a story of greed, resilience, and betrayal, and it set the stage for the world's next great conflict. Because before World War I, before the trenches of Europe, there was South Africa, a land soaked in gold and blood. At the heart of the Second Boer War was one word: gold. By the late 1800s, South Africa wasn't just another colony. Beneath its rugged hills lay the richest gold deposits on Earth, enough to make or break empires. When massive gold reserves were discovered in the Boer-controlled Transvaal region, it triggered a storm of greed that would change history forever. The Boers, descendants of Dutch settlers who had trekked deep into South Africa to escape British rule decades earlier, had built independent republics, the Transvaal and the Orange Free State. These were small farming nations, deeply religious, fiercely independent, and determined to remain free from British control. But when word spread that the ground beneath them glittered with unimaginable wealth, the British Empire saw opportunity and danger. The gold mines were largely owned by British financiers, yet controlled by Boer governments that refused to submit to London's authority. It was a clash of power and pride, a standoff between farmers defending their freedom and an empire obsessed with domination. British politicians began spreading fear. They claimed the Boers were oppressing foreign workers, known as Uitlanders. But behind that excuse was a clear motive: seizing control of the gold that fueled the empire's global ambitions. In 1895, a failed coup attempt called the Jameson Raid, backed secretly by British officials, tried to topple the Boer government. It failed miserably, humiliating Britain and deepening Boer distrust. But it also made war inevitable. The British couldn't tolerate defiance from what they saw as a handful of stubborn farmers. The Boers, proud and deeply rooted in their independence, refused to bow. By 1899, tensions reached their breaking point. The Boers issued an ultimatum: either Britain withdrew its troops from their borders, or face war. Britain laughed off the demand. Days later, the first shots were fired. The Boers struck first, fast, precise, and deadly. Against the might of the largest empire on earth, these frontier farmers launched a rebellion that would shake the world. But little did they know, the full weight of British vengeance was coming, and soon the war for gold would become a war of extermination. When the war began, Britain expected a quick victory. After all, what chance did a few thousand farmers have against the largest empire in history? But the Boers fought like ghosts, striking from the hills, vanishing into the veld, and ambushing supply lines with deadly precision. Their mobility, marksmanship, and knowledge of the terrain stunned British generals. For months, the British suffered humiliating defeats at places like Colenso, Spion-Kop, and Montjesfontein. Thousands of British soldiers were killed or captured by men fighting on horseback, dressed in dusty coats and wide-brimmed hats, men who carried no uniforms but infinite resolve. The world watched in disbelief. The mighty empire was being humiliated by farmers, and that humiliation demanded revenge. When Lord Kitchener took command, the tone of the war changed forever. Unable to defeat the Boers in open battle, Britain turned to total war. The new strategy: destroy everything that could sustain the enemy. British troops began burning Boer farms to the ground. Entire villages were reduced to ash. Livestock was slaughtered. Crops torched. Wells poisoned. Families were left with nothing. Their lands turned into blackened wastelands. The empire called it denying the enemy resources. History would call it scorched earth. But the most horrifying chapter was yet to come. Tens of thousands of Boer women and children were rounded up and sent to what the British politely called refugee camps. In reality, these were concentration camps, the first of their kind in modern history. Barbed wire, filth, starvation, and disease became their daily reality. The camps were overcrowded, unsanitary, and cruelly mismanaged. Food was scarce, water contaminated, and medical care almost non-existent. By the war's end, over 26,000 Boer women and children had died, most from disease and hunger. Some camps saw child mortality rates above 50. These weren't soldiers, they were civilians. Mothers clutching infants, children wasting away in the dust, their cries echoing through the empire's silence. Even worse, the British extended this cruelty to black Africans too. Over 100,000 were imprisoned in their own camps, forced into labor, and left to die without recognition or memorials. The British public was told it was for their protection, but behind the propaganda lay a darker truth. It was punishment for daring to defy an empire. By 1902, the war had dragged on far longer than anyone expected. The British Empire, which had begun the campaign confident and proud, was now exhausted, humiliated, and morally stained. Yet despite its overwhelming firepower, the Boer resistance refused to die. With their cities captured and farmlands destroyed, the Boers became wanderers, turning to guerrilla warfare. They traveled in small, mobile commandos, surviving off the land, sabotaging railway lines, ambushing supply trains, and striking with terrifying speed. For 2 years, these ragtag fighters, farmers, teachers, preachers, held off the world's most powerful army. The British called them rebels. History calls them survivors, but heroism came at a heavy price. With their homes burned and families trapped in concentration camps, the Boers faced a terrible choice: fight to extinction or surrender and live under British rule. On May 31st, 1902, the Treaty of Vereeniging was signed. The war was officially over. The Boers laid down their weapons, and the British took control of both republics, the Transvaal and the Orange Free State. The cost: nearly 75,000 dead, including tens of thousands of civilians. Whole communities erased. Generations scarred. The British emerged victorious on paper, but broken in spirit. The war had drained their economy, tarnished their reputation, and exposed their empire's brutality to the world. For the first time, global newspapers questioned whether the British were truly civilized rulers. And for the Boers, victory and defeat came in a cruel form. They lost their independence, but they planted the seed of Afrikaner nationalism, a bitter legacy that would one day reshape South Africa forever. Many Boer leaders, once freedom fighters, became politicians under British rule. They spoke of reconciliation, but in their hearts burned resentment, a desire to rebuild, to reclaim dignity, and to restore what had been taken. It was from this quiet fury that a new idea was born, one that would eventually divide South Africa for generations: the belief that white unity, not equality, was the path forward. Out of the ashes of war, the foundations of apartheid began to take shape, not as a sudden creation, but as the poisoned fruit of an empire's conquest and a people's trauma. The Second Boer War didn't just redraw the map of Africa, it rewrote its destiny. When history remembers the Second Boer War, it often speaks of British generals and Boer commandos, white men fighting for gold, pride and empire. But beneath that story lies another, one that has been silenced for more than a century. The story of the black Africans who fought, suffered and died in a war that was never theirs. Over 100,000 African laborers, porters and scouts were pulled into the conflict, many by force, others by necessity. They carried supplies, dug trenches, built railways, and risked their lives on battlefields that would never bear their names. The Boers distrusted them. The British used them, and when the war ended, both sides discarded them. The British Empire promised protection to Africans who worked for them, but that promise was hollow. Thousands were captured and sent to segregated concentration camps, separate from the Boers. These camps were even harsher: no medical care, little food, and almost no record-keeping. Many starved to death. Others died of disease or exhaustion. Their graves were left unmarked. The exact number of African deaths is still debated, but historians estimate at least 20,000, 30,000, possibly more. And yet, when the peace treaty was signed, not one African representative was invited to the table. They had fought and died for an empire that would deny their existence. Imagine the bitterness. You lose your home, your freedom, your family, and when the war ends, you're told you were never part of history. But their silence wasn't weakness, it was survival. In the decades that followed, many of their descendants would rise as workers, miners, and freedom fighters to challenge the same systems that had erased their ancestors. The seeds of future resistance, the movements that would one day bring apartheid to its knees, were planted here in the forgotten suffering of the Africans who endured both Boer oppression and British cruelty. And yet, even today, monuments across South Africa tell only part of the story. Statues honor generals, not laborers. Museums remember soldiers, not servants. The empire recorded its victories, but it erased its victims. History textbooks speak of glory, not grief. But listen closely, and you can almost hear their voices in the wind that sweeps across the veld. The unmarked graves whispering truths no empire could bury forever. The Second Boer War didn't just break nations, it silenced a people. And reclaiming their story isn't just history, it's justice. When the guns fell silent in 1902, the real war, the war for memory, had just begun. The British Empire couldn't afford to let the truth of the Boer War stain its image. Too many civilians had died. Too many generals had failed. Too many headlines had called it what it was, a moral catastrophe. So London launched one of the first large-scale propaganda campaigns in modern history. Newspapers, photographs, and public exhibitions were carefully controlled to reshape the narrative. What the world had seen as slaughter, Britain recast as civilization's triumph over barbarism. Official reports downplayed the horror of the concentration camps. Instead of starving children, they showed smiling refugees. Instead of burned farms, they spoke of strategic relocations. The words changed, and so did public perception. In Parliament, critics like Emily Hobhouse, who had exposed the camp's atrocities, were dismissed as emotional women or unpatriotic voices. When she presented evidence of malnourished children, the government tried to bury her report. But her courage forced the world to confront the truth that the empire of progress had built its victories on human suffering. And yet, most of Britain chose comfort over conscience. They wanted heroes, not horror. So the narrative shifted. Generals like Kitchener were recast as saviors, and the war became a necessary sacrifice for the peace and unity of South Africa. That lie, repeated in classrooms, history books, and royal speeches, endured for decades. Even when veterans returned home broken, traumatized, and disillusioned, their stories were suppressed. The empire had no room for shame, only glory. But the truth had witnesses. Photographers like Frederick Villiers and Christian de Wet, and journalists who defied censorship, captured the unsanitized reality: women with hollow eyes, fields of burned corpses, and orphaned children standing in ruins. Those haunting images would resurface decades later when new generations began to question what their ancestors had done in Africa. The British had claimed moral superiority, yet they invented the modern concentration camp. They spoke of liberty, yet imprisoned nations. They claimed to bring light, yet left ashes in their wake. The Second Boer War became a lesson in manipulation, how power rewrites pain, and how history can be weaponized to hide guilt. But lies don't last forever. Time has a way of unearthing the buried, and the ghosts of the Boer War, both white and black, would not stay silent forever. When the Treaty of Vereeniging ended the war, it promised reconciliation between Britain and Boer. But behind that word lay betrayal, especially for the black Africans who had lost everything. The treaty granted the Boers amnesty and financial aid to rebuild their farms. They were even allowed to self-govern again under British supervision. But there was a condition, one line that would shape South Africa's fate for nearly a century. No voting rights shall be extended to the native population. That single sentence sealed a future of segregation. It was Britain's unspoken deal with the defeated Boers: unity for whites, silence for everyone else. From the ashes of war, two former enemies began to build a shared identity. White South Africa, the Boers, humiliated in battle, found pride in their suffering. The British, eager to maintain order, empowered them politically. Together, they crafted a nation bound not by freedom, but by fear. Fear of losing control to the people they had both oppressed. It started slowly. Black Africans were denied land ownership. Then came the Mines and Works Act, locking them into low-wage labor. Then the Land Act of 1913, which banned them from owning 87% of South Africa's land. Every new law echoed the old war. The same divide, the same cruelty, now written into law instead of fought with guns. And as the decades passed, those laws hardened into ideology, apartheid. The concentration camps had shown white leaders how to control populations through separation, deprivation, and fear. The logic was the same. Control the land, control the people, control the story. The Boers, once victims of imperial cruelty, now became architects of oppression. Their trauma didn't end the system. It became its blueprint. The British taught them the machinery of empire, and they perfected it. The tragic irony: the very people who once fought for freedom would deny it to millions. By the mid-20th century, apartheid had become the law of the land. It justified every injustice in the name of order. But its roots lay in the Boer War, in the camps, in the fields burned to ash. So when the world condemned apartheid, few realized that its origins were not just South African, they were imperial. It was the child of conquest, born from the empire that claimed to civilize the world while crushing those who resisted it. The Second Boer War didn't just change Africa. It created the foundations of a system that would haunt the continent for nearly a century. For years after the war, Britain tried to bury what it had done. Official reports softened the truth. Textbooks called it a necessary conflict. Politicians described the camps as unfortunate but humane. But no amount of rewriting could hide the reality. The British Empire, the so-called beacon of civilization, had unleashed terror on its own subjects. The empire that prided itself on order and morality had burned farms, starved women, and turned children into corpses. And when the world began to ask questions, London responded not with honesty, but with silence. Even today, many British history books barely mention the concentration camps of the Boer War. They focus on military tactics, on generals and medals, on how the war modernized the army. But they skip the part where thousands of civilians were deliberately starved to death. They skip the part where human lives were reduced to logistics, just another line in a military report. Why? Because admitting the full truth means admitting that the British Empire was not just a political power, it was an engine of cruelty. It means facing the fact that the same empire that abolished slavery once created camps eerily similar to those that would later appear in Nazi Germany. Historians now see the Boer War as a turning point, not just militarily, but morally. It revealed the true cost of empire, the rot beneath the grandeur. The British public, once proud of conquest, began to question what empire really meant. Newspapers published photos of emaciated children. Activists demanded justice. One woman, Emily Hobhouse, became a national scandal simply for telling the truth. She visited the camps and reported exactly what she saw: disease, starvation, neglect. Her words shook Parliament, but they didn't stop the system. Emily was labelled a traitor. She faced ridicule, threats, and political isolation, but her courage planted a seed. The idea that empire wasn't glory, it was guilt, and yet Britain never fully faced that guilt. After the war, memorials were built for soldiers, not for the civilians who died in the camps. Streets were named after generals, not after mothers who buried their children in shallow graves. The empire honored its conquerors, not its victims, but history has a way of returning, like an echo that refuses to fade. The images from those camps, the hollow faces, the wasted bodies, would resurface decades later when the world saw them again in Europe during World War II. The tactics Britain once used in Africa had not disappeared. They had evolved. The Boer War was not just a colonial skirmish. It was a warning, a glimpse of what the 20th century would become. Industrialized warfare, dehumanization, the belief that civilians were expendable in the name of order, and yet, for so long, Britain called it victory. But victory at what cost? If you trace the shadow of modern conflict, from concentration camps to propaganda, from total war to psychological warfare, it all begins here, in the scorched fields of South Africa. The ghosts of the empire never truly left. They just changed uniforms. Amid the empire's triumphal parades and political silence, a handful of voices dared to speak the truth. They were not generals, not kings, not historians, but ordinary people who refused to look away. Their courage would change how the world remembered the Boer War forever. Emily Hobhouse, a name history tried to erase, was one of them. She wasn't a soldier or politician. She was a humanitarian armed with nothing but compassion and conviction. When she arrived in South Africa and saw the camps, she wrote, "I shall never forget the suffering. The faces of the children haunt me." Her words were not just reports, they were confessions of a conscience the empire had lost. She smuggled her findings back to London, presenting them before a parliament that wanted her silenced. Her testimony exposed the horrifying truth. Over 26,000 women and children had perished in British-run camps. The British press branded her a liar. Politicians called her hysterical. Yet the images, the reports, the survivors, they all proved her right. Her courage inspired others. Activists across Europe began to question Britain's civilizing mission. Journalists, clergy, and even soldiers who had seen the atrocities started to speak up. The silence began to crack, and beyond the empire, in the scorched lands of South Africa, another kind of resistance was growing, not of guns and bullets, but of memory. Boer women preserved diaries, photographs, and letters, fragments of truth hidden from the victors. They wrote about the hunger, the loss, the humiliation, ensuring that one day their suffering would not be rewritten. Meanwhile, black South Africans who had fought and labored in the shadows of the war also began to demand recognition. Thousands had been displaced, enslaved, or killed, yet history forgot them too. Their stories, buried beneath imperial pride, are only now being uncovered. In the ashes of empire, these voices became a quiet rebellion. They challenged the narrative that war is glory and empire is justice. They reminded the world that truth, no matter how small, can outlast propaganda. Emily Hobhouse once said, "Human suffering is not a matter of nationality." Her words echoed far beyond her time. They inspired future movements, from anti-colonial revolts to humanitarian campaigns that challenged imperial power everywhere. And though she died in obscurity, her work laid the foundation for the Red Cross reforms, for war reporting, for the very idea that the victims of war deserve a voice. History often celebrates conquerors, but it's the truth-tellers, the ones who stood alone against nations, who keep our humanity alive, because in the end, it wasn't the empire's armies that endured. It was the courage of those who refused to forget. When the guns finally fell silent in 1902, Britain had won on paper, but lost something far greater in spirit. The Union Jack flew over the South African plains, yet beneath it lay the broken bones of an empire's moral code. The cost of victory had been too high, too cruel, too revealing. The world had seen how far the most civilized nation on earth would go to keep its power. The concentration camps, the scorched earth, the propaganda, it all stripped away the illusion of imperial righteousness. But the echoes of the Boer War didn't end there. They rippled across decades, shaping how nations would fight and justify every war that followed. Britain learned lessons it wished it hadn't. The war became a testing ground for modern military tactics, barbed wire, trench warfare, and total destruction of civilian infrastructure. When World War I erupted, just 12 years later, many of those same British generals, Kitchener, Roberts, Haig, applied what they had learned in South Africa to the trenches of Europe, but so did the rest of the world. German officers studied the British campaign closely, refining their own doctrine of total war. Even Hitler, decades later, cited the Boer War as proof that propaganda and control of the narrative could justify any atrocity. The war also changed Africa itself. It cemented British dominance, but planted the seeds of resentment and resistance that would one day grow into the struggle against apartheid. The racial hierarchies enforced during the war, separating white Boers, black labourers and British colonists, became the blueprint for institutionalized segregation. The tragedy of the Boer War wasn't just about soldiers and politics. It was about an entire continent reshaped by blood and ideology. In Britain, public opinion shifted. The myth of the glorious empire began to crumble. Writers, poets, and thinkers questioned the moral right of empire. The world was waking up to a darker truth, that conquest and civilization were often masks for greed and control. Meanwhile, in South Africa, reconciliation came at a heavy price. The Boers regained self-rule under British oversight, but at the expense of black South Africans whose suffering and sacrifice were erased from the peace agreements. The empire healed itself by ignoring those it had wounded most deeply. And yet, despite all this pain, something else emerged from the ashes, a hard, unyielding understanding that truth, once buried, always finds its way to the surface. Today, the Boer War stands as a mirror, reflecting the arrogance of empire, the resilience of the oppressed, and the eternal cost of power built on suffering. It reminds us that history isn't written by the victors alone, it's preserved by those who refuse to forget. Empires fall, flags fade, but memory is immortal. Because every war fought in the name of pride becomes eventually a story of regret. The Second Boer War was more than a battle for territory, it was a battle for truth. A war that revealed what happens when pride blinds justice, when empire becomes more important than humanity. For years, Britain painted it as a story of victory. Textbooks called it a campaign of unification. Politicians called it a step towards civilization. But behind those words lay graves of mothers, children, and men who never asked for this war. Empires have a habit of rewriting their mistakes. They turn brutality into strategy and suffering into progress. But history doesn't belong to the powerful, it belongs to those who remember. Today, when we look at the world, at wars fought for land, for resources, for influence, the echoes of the Boer War are still there. The same propaganda, the same silence, the same belief that some lives matter more than others. That's why remembering matters. Because the past isn't just behind us, it's warning us every single day. The British Empire may have won the war, but it lost its moral authority, and that loss reshaped the 20th century. From the trenches of World War I to the fall of colonialism, the cracks began here, in the dry plains of South Africa, where truth and power collided. If this story shocked you, let it remind you of one thing. History's greatest crimes are not committed by monsters, but by men who believe they are doing good. So when someone tells you empire was glorious, remember the camps. When they say conquest was noble, remember the ashes. And when they say history is written by the victors, remind them that truth has a voice too, and it never dies. The Second Boer War wasn't just a forgotten chapter. It was a warning carved into time that even the mightiest empire can fall, not from defeat, but from the weight of its own lies. And now, it's your turn to keep that truth alive. Share it, talk about it, question what we're told. Because the next empire, the next noble war, will always try to hide behind the same words. Only remembering can stop it. Only truth can outlast power. Only you can keep history honest. This was the Second Boer War, the conflict that shook empires, changed Africa forever. If this story moved you, subscribe, share, and keep exploring the history they tried to erase. Because the more we uncover the past, the harder it becomes to repeat it.